may be from one continent or another, but that fact that we are a visual minority, that there are physical similar attributes, that kind of connects us a little bit. So in simplest terms, it's that which darkens our skin. But it's something more complex than that. When we say the black community, we often think about one large community, and that's not accurate at all. Because the black man that was born in Kingston, Jamaica, may have the same amount of melanin in his skin as the man that was born in Somalia. But they have two different narratives, two different journeys, two different cultures. Marginalize ourselves a bit when we don't acknowledge that, and we lump ourselves together as one black community. It's great to think that there's a community out there, but there's diversity within that black community. It starts with melanin because there's the connection, there's the one thing that we share, but it goes beyond that. In Alberta, I think it starts with recognition and acknowledgement of the fact that there were black people here for many years, a long time ago. At the turn of the century, there were people that have come up from America as emancipated slaves and tried to stake claim with land, and some amazing communities were born out of that. Amber Valley.
I think Edmonton was probably in the beginning of building streets and sidewalks. At that time, wooden sidewalks. And I remember all the horses now. You hear the harnesses and that sort of thing. There were harnesses all around the place, and wholesale places where they were bringing stuff and shipping stuff out. There was all kinds like that, but there weren't many black people around. I've heard that there were things in the paper that said, come to Canada and we'll give you a chance. Now, I haven't seen anything like that, but I've heard that it was said. And then on the other hand, I've heard that they said they didn't want any. Well, leave the American niggers there where they belong. And even when I was just entering my teens, I was probably 12, there were still 2 buildings downtown that had signs that no niggers allowed, but then they had paint over it. Paint had worn, and you could still see it. It was just starting to come through because it's been there for years. That was that was before I was a teenager anyway. But even after I became grown up, there were these 2 buildings that I could see. One of them says no Negroes allowed. It had been painted over, but through time it had, and you could still see some of it. There were 2 of them like that. One of them still standing. Working for people at that time was hard. I remember my dad, what he did was hoe somebody's garden that somebody worked in the daytime, and so my dad would get a job hoeing their garden, whatever little work they could pick up. My brother picking up cigarette butts and selling them to somebody that wanted them.
Setting assumptions about black people, especially on TV, what's projected is the image of black people in the United States. Now, you will find that people here, I don't know how many times you've heard somebody say, hey, you African Americans, like African American. I mean, how are you identifying me as an African American? Because in their minds, at least what they see on TV, whatever, is mostly based on the image of African American.
It's very easy to point out and say, you're black. You know what I mean? And maybe I can go talk to him about P. Diddy or some black guy who did something in my neighborhood before. Whereas sometimes I rarely get like that genuine conversation, like, hey, how's your kids doing? Or, hey, how's basketball team going on?
Because there's negatives to old black and there's negatives to new black as well, right? There are things that are harmful about both identities, and they're all rooted, I find, in some sort of white supremacist ideas.
Being black in terms of how I've thought of it throughout my life, I think it shifted from a collective thought of being black to an individual thought. So I think when you're younger, you don't know who you are as much. You're trying to find out through other people, through looking at your family or your friends and trying to form your identity. But I think when you get older, you can become more of an individual. So I think being black for me right now is more of whoever I am at a certain point in my life or a certain point in the day. I think that's really how I define being black, I guess.
I did not realize I was black, or didn't necessarily relate with the term black until I migrated to North America as an international student several years back. There were other markers of identity that were operative, but none of it was necessarily about the black-white dichotomy, which you find prevalent in this part of the world.
Because of what our ancestors went through, because all our ancestors were punished and beaten, right? Hands chopped off, lynched, because they wanted to progress. And of course, the powers to be in slavery and slave masters didn't want that from our ancestors. So education is the key, isn't it? It has always been the key, and especially for us. And I think about that now, what I've been able to accomplish. And I think the ancestors, especially my African ones, will have been very pleased because they fought and died for that right for us. They sacrificed themselves for us, so we would have the chance to do these things.
One thing I remember is the house that we used to live in, the apartment, the first apartment that my parents rented. There was always something at the back of the wall. And in my language, it's, I should say, Ekofonmobiri Adiomore Nyamuri, which means education for a female child, kind of strengthens or prepares the child for what is next to come for the country of Nigeria.
Our system is such, we celebrate people who were colonialists, who are racists, who allowed the decimation of indigenous populations.
It's evolving. You know, I think it's a living entity. It's something that continues to grow and change. Certainly I think it's really important for us to be aware of the history of how Canada began. You know, how those initial relationships between European settlers and the First Nations, how those went. You know, I was just at another event today, talking with some folks about the treaties that were signed and the obligations and everything that were involved in that. So certainly I think we have to recognize that the roots of our nation are built, as you said, on colonialism. You know, on other people coming in and sort of imposing their culture, their views, sort of taking over land that belonged to someone else, and that we did sort of displace another people and another culture.
My first learnings were from my mother in her womb, and then my grandma, natural law. Then from natural law to coming into being shipwrecked to residential school. That wasn't education, that was being imprisoned. It was imprisonment, it was a way to get rid of us. It hasn't changed.
You know what they taught us in school? I didn't want to see a book that was supposed to be about black people because they all looked horrible. Everything they had was designed to make us feel down here and stay down there.
And it's important that the curriculum does not seek to directly or indirectly bring down one group or the other, because texts are powerful. The materials that kids encounter are powerful. The cartoons that they watch are powerful.
We work all day, we work all night, we never learn to read or write. We're happy-hearted house of house. When other folks have gone to bed, we stay until we're all...
The way characters are portrayed, the kinds of roles we give them, the diction, the words, the grammar, the way the so-called facts are presented, all of these things are crucial within the system. And so that necessarily means that the authorities have to do their due diligence with respect to texts that are viewed as necessary or required or compulsory within the system.
The books are so biased. There's a lot of racism in there. The history is so wrong. The books promoted racism. There were some books that I tried to get off the shelves that promoted racism, and my kids had to suffer because of that.
In Malawi, for instance, one of the things that helped establish my identity in Malawi was that when I went to school, I learned about African history. I learned about the kingdoms that were there. Like we talk about the Kushite, the Kush kingdom, the Mali kingdoms. We talk about Mansa Musa, or we talk about Kozakohom, Shaka Zulu. When Europeans came in, so all of that history was part of my identity, and I knew what my people had done in order for them to favor themselves in the community.
Education is definitely an obstacle. I feel like education is the link to any sort of progression as a society at all. Justice cannot coexist with ignorance. If you want to change something, you have to know how to do it. You have to be in a position where you're able to do that. So the biggest challenge for Black youth and Black people in general is achieving or going through the education system and coming out of it stronger rather than weaker.
I would say that they need more people, more advisors to be at the beginning when they're trying to change the curriculum, because the curriculum has changed like pretty much every 5 to 10 years. And each time they try and address something, so, oh, well, we haven't talked about this perspective, we haven't talked about that perspective. But still for me as a teacher, when I flip through the textbook, I'm like, when am I gonna see a black guy that isn't Kofi Annan or Nelson Mandela?
Students should be able to see themselves within the curriculum. That has become a big issue, not just at the grade school level, but even at the university level. Because the reality is that educators have a choice, and especially beyond the grade school level, as to what students read, as to whose materials are made required texts, what kinds of materials are recommended, which ones are not recommended. All of these things are choices that we make. Teaching of facts as they are, especially historical facts, that is important, even when those histories are difficult and problematic. It also means that we're also cognizant of where we wish to go, where we wish to be as a society. And so the syllabus and the entire curriculum within an education system would have to reflect our ideals as well, not just where we were or where we are, but where we hope to go to.
In our curriculum right now, we focus on 3 topics. I think it's in grade 10, globalization, grade 11, nationalism, and grade 12, I think it's ideology. Rarely do we talk about the contributions made by ethnic minorities in all of those wars, and also the effects that those wars had on ethnic minorities. I think there's one paragraph about Haile Selassie in our entire grade 11 textbook, and how he was trying to petition to get more rights for Ethiopia during the war. And for me, that's something when I read, I was like, okay, well, where's the rest? Why isn't there more talking about this? I mean, is his story not mean that much? And by not including it, what does that say about our contributions? What does that say to the student? Well, maybe I should just focus on Adolf Hitler and all the negative things that he did, but why can't I talk about what my people did with this specific event?
Representation is critical because it's a dialogue that is constantly ongoing in society. I'll give you an instance, and I don't recall the specific country now, but that it might have been Australia or somewhere. Kids were at a good playground and were asking one another what they hoped to do in the future. So girls and boys and so on. One of the boys said to the group that he wanted to be prime minister when he grew up. And the girls started laughing. And they said to him, no, only girls can be prime minister. Men or boys cannot be prime minister. And the boy, of course, was disappointed because he wanted to be prime minister. Now, it's interesting because in the entire life of those girls under the age of 8, there was always a female prime minister. So they had assumed that prime ministers were by default females and not males. The moral there is representation. We can use that as a pedestal to look at things widely. The images and imageries that we show a group about themselves are very powerful, especially for young, impressionable minds. If all we show people are criminals in movies, in rap artists and so forth, we are reproducing that without knowing. Now, advertisers spend billions of dollars to showcase their products on TV every day. What you're being shown about yourself says about you and how it shapes who you become. Chimamanda Adichie, the Nigerian writer, said just a few years back, and I quote, "Show a people as one thing only, over and over again, and that is what they become."
It's based on a model of, in some ways, liberalism that's focused on markets. It's focused on preparing youth to join workforces. And I think we need to really rethink what our focus is for education, right? Because I think once we do, if our focus for education then is about creating good people who care about one another and care about their environment and the land and about that type of a world, then I think that we can rethink what our curriculum looks like, because then our curriculum might actually talk about issues like justice. Then we might be able to talk about the ways in which our lives as people of color or as Black people or as Indigenous people are actually all connected. Because I think that one of the things that our curriculum does at the moment is that it teaches us things in separation from one another, so we actually don't see the links.
With a lot of things, when you don't see yourself reflected in a certain power structure, you're less likely to want to involve yourself in that power structure. You see no one who's been through similar experiences to you. You see no one who really resonates with who you are as a person. You're less likely to enter that. That same thing happens with governance. When you look at governance structures as a whole, the majority of people in governance structures are from wealthy Caucasian families, right? That's just how it generally comes from, or middle class or upper middle class, right? You rarely see people from lower income. You rarely see people that are recent immigrants. You rarely see women. You rarely see people of color. And if you don't see those groups in a structure of governance, in something like the parliament or the legislature, or your city council or your students' union, then you're less likely to want to go there.
What I always do in my classes, I always tell the students to write from the heart first and address the issue as if it was you experiencing it. So every grade 10 class that I talk about colonization, imperialism, and slavery, we always watch the experience of one person who went through it. And then I say, okay, write how you would feel if you were a part of this situation. Slavery, residential schools, colonization. How would you act if you were the person sitting in your home, chilling, relaxing, eating food, and all of a sudden people came in with knives and guns and said, you're gonna come with me, rope your neck up, throw you away, kill your mother, kill your father, take you to another country, strip your name from you, tell you that you are owned, you don't have any type of liberty as a human being. How would you feel? And then from that moment, every single person has to address that. Even if they don't write something down, they know that up here they've already addressed that. They can't write something down because it hurts that bad. Or even if they try to ignore it, they know that there's something deep inside of them that's telling them to ignore it. Then that's some more learning that could happen. We could talk about our own diverse perspectives and have current events where you could research your home country, or have an assignment where you could research someone from your culture and then present it to the class. That's what I would look for in terms of inclusiveness for color. But I mean, we could look at religion, we could look at disabilities, we could look at anything there.
If you're teaching about our history, I feel just even bringing someone from our community that is successful, that can share their story, right? That can appropriately explain what it means, where they came from, who they are, getting our elders to teach, right? And then balancing that with the curriculum.
And to bring in those would also make room for individuals who may not come from traditional background. In my department, for instance, there's been an effort by a research group led by my colleague Rob Shields to look at the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, who was an African-American scholar whose contributions to the discipline of sociology seem to have been minimized over the years. And it's important that the works of individuals like that are recognized and celebrated for what they are.
I think I knew 2 people that taught school, and they couldn't teach in the city. They did not want black teachers in the city, so they sent them into the country as far away as they could get them. I remember my son, Susan's brother, was telling me about a teacher that they had at the school that Bob went to. This is just a few years ago. And he had been all the way through, as far as he went, before they got a black teacher in that school. We used to have come first, second, third, all that. I stayed in the first 5 because I figured, my head might look different on the outside, but it's smarter on the inside. I told them that too.
Depending on an educator, if that educator does not have the experiences of, and really when you say the experiences, really the knowledge of whether it's around black history, black culture, sort of the issues or challenges that they face in that kind of space, then how can they then teach a student about black culture or the experiences that they're going to experience down the road, or how to deal with the police?
Students learn better that way. Students, in fact, benefit from having diverse faculty, diverse teachers. And so it's not a favor that is done to any ethnicity or group to have them on the roll as educators. It's in fact beneficial to the students. I would imagine that my being a Nigerian, my being a black person, my being a black professor in a classroom enhances the quality of learning that my students get, because I bring to the classroom a series of experiences that they may not necessarily get where I originally from this part of the world. And that reflects, this may interest you, that reflects in my evaluations, and my students talk about the perspectives that they didn't know before that I'm able to bring in.
So do we give the opportunity for others to get to know our culture? So what needs to happen, in my view, is we need to make time and to put resources for everyone to share their culture, their way of life, the language that we bring into this country as we come here.
When I came to Toronto, I was in my teens, but I had a young son. And I remember one time, the first time he went to school, it was an all-white school, and that would have been quite a few years back. And he came home crying because they had called him chocolate face. And I'm going, I was ready to defend my boy. And being told that, and it's interesting because what I was told impacted me because it reflected what my own, how I was raised. If something bothers you, do something about it. So when the principal said, well, these kids don't know what it's like having another child from another culture, and she said, more or less, if it bothers you, do something about it. And I thought, okay, yeah, it bothers me. It did bother me. So I ended up volunteering in that school for 2 days a week, teaching the students about being black, from Jamaica, being different, that my son became this wonderful guy because his mother was so interesting, and she talked about good things and food, and she'd bring food in and they'd try with little kids. So we learned that if we want change, we have to do something about it.
We need to be self-governing. And so, with the traditional education system, that's perfect and it's in place to once again allow us to build knowledge and experiences and practicality, but never will the education system be able to be caught up in terms of teaching us in terms of our background, our culture, our roots, who we are as a people. And so because of that, I think to try to change that system in itself, it's broken. The solution to that is kind of having your own extracurricular activities, programs, community centers, and use that to really build and engage your community and have that complementary, so then people understand how to, who they are as an individual or who we are as a community, and then position that as this is how you operate within the bigger community, whether it's in Edmonton or the business world. The system itself is predicated on just teaching a blanket audience, just the general population, so it's not detailed enough or not specific enough to allow us as a community or even as a culture to be engaged in what's relevant to us. And that's why you'll see all these other cultural groups have their own schools.
That was probably the beginning of my knowledge of self, was studying Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, Medgar Evers, the story of Emmett Till, the grind of Barack Obama, Bill Russell, Will Chamberlain, Muhammad Ali, just every single guy out there who did something incredible. And not just guys, the women, the Billie Holidays for jazz, and the Maya Angelou's, and all these ladies who contributed to our history. It just made me know that when I was out there, I wasn't just representing myself on an educational level, it was everybody.
I know when I was growing up, the only mention of Indigenous people was Pocahontas, who, was American for one thing, and it was a very skewed story. We had very little mention of the role that Indigenous people played before colonialism happened, and there was very little reflection of Black history. So there's lots of room for improvement on that front, both telling the negative side, but also showing the achievements of Black people and people of all cultures who've contributed to Canada. I think that's really important for students to hear that in the classroom, and for other people in the classroom to hear it as well.
Canada would not allow us to pray the way we wanted it. It was taken away from us by law. From the Queen to the Pope, from the Pope to Canada, and was to kill off the Indians. That law was made in 1885. 1885, 7 of my great-grandfathers got hung. 1885, 240 of my relatives, my old relatives, my grandmother's grandparents, and her brothers and sisters fled with the bundles to Rocky Boy on foot. when people say there's no ethnic cleansing, what do you think that was? Same thing that happened in Africa.
As a Black woman, I should say, there's that issue of being sexualized as a Black woman, being unappreciated as a Black woman, and then being in these spaces where sometimes there's this discomfort as well, where I could still be the only Black woman. I also would think that in the context of Black activism as well, that the Black female voice needs to have more of a profile.
At one point in North American history, it was the hardest thing to be a Black woman. Like like nothing else was harder than being a Black woman, because you not only were a woman, you were also, one of the most hated races on the continent. Hatred that deep and that structural doesn't just evaporate into thin air. It morphs. It changes shape. And right now, a lot of that hatred is very small, very subtle, or very microaggressions. It's been a rough go, it seems. It's been a very hard thing, a very hard and arduous task for Black women to be recognized as full human beings before their skin and before what's between their legs, And it seems like almost every facet of this society is built against Black womanness, all that it is, the power, the strength.
At work today, I was listening to a podcast called Canada Land, and the host interviewed this guy. He's like a writer, cartoonist, whatever, and he asked him about the refugee crisis, and he's maybe the least qualified person to talk about it, because he was talking through fear. He was talking through this emotion of we need to secure our borders, and the law is the law, and kind of just simplifying the matter and making it very black and white. The reality is it's not a black and white situation, and these people are running from their lives. So when we see people who have their kids on their backs crossing the US-Canada border in the middle of the winter, take that shit really seriously. They're not just doing it to get a citizenship, or they're not just doing it to just get a job. They're running for their lives. And we need people to stop forcing this narrative that refugees, and even the ones that come illegally, are going to hurt our country and all of that. A lot of them, they work really, really hard. They do their best to, stay pretty low-key and just provide for their families. People leave for a lot of reasons. It's war, it's dictatorships, it's, not having the freedom to move around. It's, no freedom of press. There's not that much of a difference between what they want with their families and what these, real Canadians want with their families.
If they called you a nigger, you had to fight them or ignore them. Hard to ignore though, because if you didn't fight them, they just keep it up. My brother was 3 years younger than I. His birthday was on the 31st of August. School started on the second day of September, because September 1 was Labor Day. He turned 6 on the end of the month, started in school a day or two after that, and couldn't get into the school before he had a fight, because kids are calling him nigger, 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 and he was fighting. I'm looking around because I have to take him into the school to take him into the principal so he can be registered. And he's, Billy, where are you? He's on fighting already. So I kept walking. I thought maybe he'll see that I'm still going, and he'll follow me into the school, because we have to see the principal to get him registered in school. He didn't show up in the school, and I went into the school and I told Mr. Southern, the principal, I said, my brother is outside in the schoolyard, but he'll be coming in. He walked over and looked out the window and opened up the window, and I hear all this racket going on. Yeah, do it, yeah. So I walked over and peeked, and there's a fight. My brother's in the fight. First day of school. Hasn't even got in the school, and he's in a fight. The principal stood there and looked out the window for a while, and then he closed the window and went downstairs, out the door, and walked over there. Of course, this kid that my brother was fighting knew to stop. My brother had gotten all, he just turned 6. He'd been 6 a whole day. And this other kid was in grade 6. But you can believe he remembered my brother for a long time.
The first day I ever got called a racial slur, it was a young dude, we was in the playground, he came up to me, he's like, yo, are you ABC? And I'm like, what's ABC? He's like, African booty cleaner. I'm like, what the hell is this? I'm like, this is grade 4. I went and told my mom, like, what is this fool telling me? And then the next day, another dude came up to me and he called me the N-word, straight up. And, you know, I didn't know how to take it. I really didn't know how to understand. I'm like, what? I thought my name was Andrew.
5 or 6 years old, I remember we went on a camping trip and we were staying at a campground and I was there on the swings and there was some kid and he called me a nigger. And that was the first time I'd ever heard the word. I didn't really understand what it meant and it didn't really settle in much for me. So it's not something I really thought about a whole lot. You know, sort of growing up, I was kind of aware that I was black, I guess, but, you know, didn't really feel like I was black. So, you know, I remember like joking with friends in high school, the whitest black guy around.
Appearances matter. Appearances matter more than they should in our world, because in part they are a way of organizing a chaotic world. Who is trustworthy? Who is friendly? Who is kind? We make those split-second decisions, even though we've not had any close interactions with them. There has been heightened attention on black males.
So what does it look like? It's tricking people to think that safety is more important than human rights, and then targeting the wrong audience and incarcerating them.
It's not an effective strategy for actually, you know, putting an end to a social problem. It often means that you're focusing on some rather than others, and then potential criminals actually escape your attention in the attempt to focus on one group rather than the other.
I still think that profiling is a big problem. I myself was profiled 2 years ago on 66th Street, driving my Jeep, going to my uncle's house to pick up some rotis, and 3 police cars pulled me over and asked if I was a 290-pound black man who was hustling, and I said no. They kept me there for an hour, and they eventually ended up giving me a ticket for something that I did not do. I went to fight it, I did not win it, and then I lost a little bit of faith in the justice system. And I think that profiling is a huge issue. I think they should go through more of a vetting process, and I think that people who are put in those positions should show diversity as well. I think we need more black police officers out there, more Muslim police officers out there, everybody, so we can get all well represented as opposed to just having that one dominant understanding of what law enforcement should be. Mother and father came to Montreal. You know, there was a lot of gangs out there, there was a lot of racism, and even when we went to Canada, my mother, when she started working, I'm not gonna say the financial or educational institution, but when she started working there, somebody had left a noose on her coat rack as a joke, left a noose there. So she had to call the police, and police came through, they had to go check all the offices, all that. And I don't even know what it was, but I think it was one of her co-workers that thought it would be a funny joke to leave a noose, her being the only black woman working there. So they have that understanding of the world, and at some points they may be like, okay, we're gonna call the police, and whereas my generation would try and be a little bit more proactive and a little bit not as trusting of the police just because how we were treated treated as criminals.
The system, the Canadian system, in my view, is set up to operate in a very homogeneous way. And since there's been such a change in demographics in Canada, still we follow the same rules, in fact, as if everybody behaves the same, reacts the same, and is the same. The way they did it was by creating a jury system where people felt comfortable, and at the end of it, where they would actually voluntarily own up themselves. They didn't need to be forced into admitting guilt because they felt safe, and they were given an exit strategy in order not to offend. For example, in my own tribe, where I come from, if I struck you and you shed blood, that is very serious, to shed somebody's blood. So you were forced to come together and share a meal by actually killing a goat or a sheep or something that would shed blood in order to actually say, we have atoned for that. It's something you could not do again. So if you hurt someone and you had to go through that ritual, you would not go back repeating that because you wouldn't want to, because it would be the elders that would come together and discuss these things into a solution. And if you did not follow what they said, you were ostracized. You became excluded from things where people sat together, you were not seen as a participant. And so people were quickly wanting to reconcile, wanting to reform.
In one of my classes, my criminology professor, who was an ex-police officer, painted us a real situation. He said, when Edmonton police sees a group of visible minorities, more than 3 males, that's treated as a gang in comparison if 3 females or 3 white males were in the same kind of scenario. And as much as that's kind of ridiculous and we would love to change that, I think that's the reality of where we are today. So when it comes to the notion of why are visible minorities or why are black people overrepresented in the, in that same kind of situation, that same system, I would like to kind of shift that into understanding that there's this concept that the whole criminal or the federal jail system was created when they abolished slavery. So the whole premise of prison or policing has been fundamentally predicated off of slaves and how to manage them or keep them as slaves. Our jail systems, in Canada they're starting to happen, but in the States, our jail systems are private companies. So they're making profit. So they have to hold a certain amount of people in jail in order to make a profit. So on that same ideology, they have to, house people. And so whenever there's certain crimes, and that goes back to the whole notion of what crimes should be punished severely for jail time and things like that, which what's crimes that should not be. And so that's a whole other discussion. However, the whole punchline is there's an overrepresentation of that because of the way the system has been put in place around A, the jails trying to make a profit, and B, as a community or as a group culturally, we're looked at differently. And so it's part of the system.
I have a son danced 18 years crying. Why are we the way we are? And my people have, the old man that ran the Sundance, I asked that 4 years, when we ask for something, it's got to do it 4 years, eh? I asked for that. Why are we the way we are? Why are our men away from us? How are our men cannot be a father behind bars for drug charge, for having possession of marijuana?
There is, in my opinion, no incontrovertible evidence that people in our community commit more crimes than others. As I mentioned, unless it's any of those 3 types of crime, every other crime you can think of is a function of where you focus your attention and whether or not people report. A lot of the overrepresentation of black bodies in the criminal justice system have to do with drug offenses, and usually drug offenses for which there are in fact very serious debates. We know, for instance, that black Canadians make up roughly 2.7% of the Canadian population, but make up 9.2% of the federal prison population. So 2.7% of the Canadian population, but 9.2% of the federal prisons. Now, federal prisons are reserved for criminals who have committed offenses for which they must serve a minimum of 2 years in prison. So federal prisons are reserved for the most serious offenses and offenders. Now, the interesting thing about that statistic is that increase, which I just mentioned, so 2.7% of the population, general population, but 9.2% of the federal prisoner population, that figure has only occurred since the year 2000. There has been an increase of 52% of black Canadians in federal prisons since the year 2000. And the Office of the Correctional Investigator releases an annual report in which you can find some of these stats. Some of the reasons for this could be an increase, a huge increase in population. There is nothing to suggest that has happened. The other part of it would be surveillance and policing, and of course prosecution, and also incarceration and the lengths of sentences, and so on and so forth.
What bothers me a little bit more about our community is the incarceration rate, and it's almost closer to indigenous people, and that incarceration rate is troubling because it takes away from our human resources for building in our communities and locking them up. Our incarceration issues relate to the mentally challenged and to indigenous people and to blacks. It's a shortcut to solving the criminal. It's a shortcut to attempting to solve what is perceived as criminal problems.
Criminalizing mental health, criminalizing poverty, criminalizing the black body, criminalizing the indigenous body, criminalizing gender, right? So we criminalize anything that might shake or make social order uncomfortable. And when I say that, norms, and whose norms is it? From a white, mainstream, Eurocentric perspective, whatever they consider to be norms. If you look at EYOC or the Remand Center, majority of the people that are incarcerated are individuals that are from refugee pays. They're not even like immigrant-based, and that's where people get mixed up, right? So refugee meaning that they had the refugee life. They've experienced those traumas. They lived in like that, you know, that refugee camp, right? And it's interesting because majority of the individuals that are incarcerated are people that come from ethnic conflict, so they've experienced war. So that means they're dealing with pre-migration trauma, they're dealing with intergenerational trauma, they're dealing with dislocation from their land trauma, and then they're dealing with being profiled and carrying the black body.
So you have now an emerging market, cannabis, that's going to be legal in like 2018. There are so many people in jail that have served jail time over the last few years that dealt with marijuana. So suddenly when it's legal, like people would have that perception like, oh, you went to jail, that means you're bad, you did something terrible, you cannot get a job, I will never hire you, etc., etc., etc. And then literally when a year from now, when it becomes a social norm or gets compared to every other legal drug out there.
I grew up in Dickinsville, which is a community. It's on the north side of Edmonton. And basically the police have started adopting a more aggressive policing strategy. They'll like drive through with all the lights on or whatever, or carding or whatever. Like it's a more aggressive strategy. And then when I talk about this with like people at the U of A, they're like, oh, it's because you live in a bad area. Like that surprises me because my community is a community just like yours. Like it's not some hellhole or whatever. And I think that's something people need to break. That where, that these areas are crime ridden, that there's bad people who live there or whatever. These are normal people, and I guarantee you, if you policed as strongly in terms of drugs as you did on the north side, but on the U of A campus, the crime rate here would spike. I think that's something to keep in mind.
In terms of benefit of the doubt, in terms of situations and circumstances and so forth, it appears you have to really be on guard. You can afford, to make any error whatsoever, however small, and so I don't think you get a lot of second chances, and that takes its emotional toll on people.
The only kind of justice I could even think of would be treated the same as everybody else. They weren't about to do that. So I don't know anything about justice because it hasn't happened yet.
I'm aware that police officers have to pass a series of psychological tests. And so when you find evidence of intolerance or prejudice in recruits, then clearly you know that is trouble to come. And so, but in terms of training, there has to be an ideational framework where people are taught to unlearn some of the things that they may have learned growing up in their households.
Whenever we can work out our own problems and then work with our own systems in place, then that's when we can kind of become independent and more successful as a community and actually grow and do bigger and better things.
I want more transparency. I want to know exactly how they would address our community, number one. Number two, I want people who've been a victim of the system or been subjected to the system to allow their views to be shared with those people so they can understand how they feel. And I'm not just talking about somebody they bring in to do the job. I'm talking about the higher ups. I think the higher ups need to hear this, because once they hear this, then they can implement different processes to help the community, as opposed to feeding into that racialized notion that these black or brown or red people are always going to be doing this and they act like this, so we should treat them like this. There needs to be accountability, and there needs to be, if there was something wrong, apologize. Make it public. Say I apologize. Because listen, I've been in a situation before where I've made mistakes as a coach and I've had to apologize to people. And I hope that those people forgive me. But it's got to be the apology, and then you also have to put some action behind that too. How frequently they are arrested for those crimes, what type of plea bargains were arranged, first-time offenses, second-time offenses, third-time offenses, any type of repeat offenders, what leads to that?
Training would be number two. I've had the chance to visit the depot in Saskatchewan, the province of Saskatchewan, and was given a tour of the policing training and facilities and so on and so forth. Increasingly, the police are being asked to deal with issues that have very little to do with policing. They're being asked almost to serve as mental health professionals on our streets. And we have to recognize that it's an onerous job, it's an onerous responsibility. And it's important that they have the requisite tools and training to be able to do that which their job now calls for. And that is to be able to understand the circumstances that are prevalent today, and that an individual may not be acting rudely. You first of all have to understand why they're acting the way they're acting, and that force is not necessarily the first line or the first option that could be used in every situation. Honorable Frank Yacobucci's recommendation, which was made in 2015 to the Toronto Police Service. This was a report that was prepared for the Toronto Police Service following the death of Sami Yatim. Sami Yatim was killed in July 2013, I believe, on that Toronto streetcar. And Honorable Frank Yacobucci was asked to lead an inquiry and offer recommendations to the Toronto Police Service. Now, the report, which came out in 2015, a fairly big document, 413 pages. Now, but buried somewhere in that document is an interesting recommendation among several wonderful recommendations. On page 138, there's a recommendation about giving preference to individuals with higher education in the police establishment. In other words, the challenges of policing in today's world are different. Now, and so Honorable Yacobucci's committee or inquiry basically recommended that the police should strongly consider recruiting university graduates. And I couldn't agree more than that. In part because studies, especially from the United States, have shown that police officers with higher levels of education, university degrees and so forth, tend to rely less on force. They tend to engage a lot more. They tend to, in fact, recommend that suspects be given mental health care than those who have not had higher education. Having a university degree necessarily makes anybody a better police officer than someone who is not a university degree holder. And the report, in fact, clearly notes that, and that a lot of the widely celebrated police officers today who have had incredibly wonderful careers as police officers never, in fact, went to university. So there are issues around the fairness of the system. So, for instance, with respect to quite specifically Aboriginal overrepresentation within the criminal justice system, we know that Aboriginal people, for instance, even when you hold the crime constant, get lengthier sentences than non-Aboriginals in this country. That's a statistical fact. We know that they are more likely to be denied bail. We know that they're more likely to be held or incarcerated prior to their cases being heard in court.
The lack of understanding of our natural law, our traditions, if they understood that, if they would listen.
A lot of my peers went in different directions, but I felt like if they just had somebody like that in their life, that things would change. That's why I think it's important for me as a 33-year-old man and other 33-year-old black guys in the community. It's our time to step up and and not to sit on the peripheral no more and just be like, well, I take care of my kids. What? It takes a village to raise a child, man. We got to get out there and do it together. Otherwise, yes, we're going to hear about this, that, and the third happening in the hood, or this happening in the streets, and the Jamaican community is violence, or the Sudanese community is violence, and the Somali community is violence, and the media will latch on to that instead of looking at all the positive things we do if we don't promote it.
Well, I think the media has had to do some work about how some communities are only mentioned in the media when there is a negative story, and to balance that off with positive stories from those communities, or to have people from non-mainstream communities involved in panel discussions. It's not necessarily about their community, it's just talking about issues that affect everyone. There's an increase in property taxes. Why wouldn't you have people from a variety of communities be part of your coverage? So I think more balanced representation is something that the media does not always achieve, and also sometimes the negative coverage of issues without the balance of also positive stories affects those communities too.
If we had a mentor, a teacher, a person who's transparent that looks like us to say, this is what I did, this is what I, like, this is how I overcame this or that, I think we get a lot more context, because it's not all just hard work or trying or showing up. There's a lot more stuff that's going on than just that.
We should educate ourselves. Not just wait for the teacher to tell us what to do, or for our parents to tell us something to do. We should educate ourselves. And for a lot of us in that time, we didn't do that. We just like, oh, let's go play ball, let's watch BET, let's go to the cookouts. We didn't really think, well, let's study the Constitution, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, every single law code that affects us as individuals. We didn't do that. So even myself, I got into some trouble in high school, and I didn't know what was going to happen to me. And had I known, I would have interfered with the law in any way.
Is to teach students essentially to challenge systems, especially where they are not favorable to them or even to those with whom they have no relationship or ties. And that's the work of emancipation. In other words, it's not enough to simply teach individuals to survive within a system. Or we have to teach them in a way that, yes, they have to survive and they have to thrive, and that is important, but also to take up causes and to be intimately involved even in issues that don't directly affect us. And that's the work of education. It is only through education that we're able to see things from the perspective of the other, to be able to understand without necessarily agreeing with a standpoint that is opposed to ours. Education is that which teaches us to be able to look at things from a perspective that we may in fact find abhorrent to us. And so I believe education ought to teach not just tolerance, but acceptance and mutual coexistence.
I would advise people to kind of identify those people within the community that have survived and have also reached high. Because I think as young people, what was important to me is to see people like me that have actually been able to get there.